Hello, everybody. Hi, Fernando. Hi, Terry. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to host today in a Scribe webinar, Fernando Enrile and Terry Daniel. The webinar is called The Good, Bad, and Beautiful Software Supply Chain Trust, Risk, and Compliance. And you are in the correct place if you believe that trust is invaluable, risk is to be mitigated, and compliance, if done seamlessly, can indeed be a work of art. We will discuss here the implications of the Executive Order 14028, the SSDF guidance, the pivotal role of CISA, what's going on with the self-attestation form, what's going on beyond the ocean, in Europe and elsewhere, and the essence of building trust with third-party software and understanding the risks associated with AppSec and DevSecOps environments. But first, let's start with introducing our distinguished guests here. Let's start with you, Terry. Terry O'Daniel is the head of security at Amplitude. His specialty is building lean security engineering teams to solve complex challenges at scale via automation and telemetry, rather than compliance by spreadsheet. Before Amplitude, Terry built and led security teams at Instacart, Netflix, Salesforce, and Yahoo. He also worked in consulting to build security strategy, vCISO, and cyber risk quantification offerings for companies in highly regulated industries. Thank you for being here, Terry.
Thanks for having me, Ruby. It's great to be here.
Fernando. Fernando Enrile is the head of trust under the Office of Cyber at Marqeta. He has 15 years of experience working in Silicon Valley, starting his career as a system engineer before transitioning to the IT audit and security compliance space. His specialty is building high-performing tech and security compliance teams, partnering with engineering functions to improve security and compliance posture of organizations, and achieving organizational goals. Thank you for coming, Fernando.
Thank you, Ruby, for having me here.
A few words about me and about Scribe before we start. So I'm the CEO of Scribe Security, and I'm also a co-founder. Scribe Security is a software supply chain security platform providing applying the concepts of continuous assurance and zero trust to protect software products, pipelines, and processes from development to deployment. Basically, the four biggest things that we do is we are providing complete visibility of the SDLC risk posture. It's a kind of SBOM management platform meeting ASPM platform. The second thing is prevent software tampering. Real exploitation, detection, and prevention of sophisticated attacks on the CI/CD. The third thing that we do is frictionless SDLC governance. We're using policy as code to be implemented directly into the CI/CD pipelines. So you could use guardrails to verify and gate your policy. And the last thing is continuous evidence-based compliance with SSDF, SALSA, or any customized policy or customers' requirements out there. All right, let's start directly with what we came all to hear. And let's start with covering the compliance and the regulation landscape. How did we get here? Terry, can you provide a brief overview of the evolution of software supply chain compliance in the US maybe we'll start with some incidents that brought us to here, and then go on to how the governments responded to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably most people who are attending this webinar have a good understanding of the risks in the third-party space and the software supply chain space. I think it has become much more intense and something we have to address directly over the past few years. So I think I'll focus mostly on the most recent and top of mind incidents. But to start, I would say, I've been working in third-party risk management or vendor security or whatever we call it this week for almost a decade. And the evolution during that time, to me, has been pretty slow. I remember when I was a large enterprise that was selling SaaS software to a lot of traditional enterprises. About 10 years ago, I was working for one of the largest SaaS providers that the traditional enterprises were first dipping their toes into the water of using SaaS companies. And it was scary for them because they knew how to assess on-premise vendors. They knew how to assess consulting vendors, but this whole software in the cloud somewhere, it was scary. They didn't really have the processes to evaluate it. So at the time, their fallback position was, as long as we have the right to audit in our contract or in our service agreement, that's enough, right? That'll get us to the point where reactively, if something goes wrong, we can send our people in and they can, kick the tires or whatever. But proactively, theoretically, we can send one of our security team, although it may not even be the security team, it may be a compliance team or even internal auditors. We can send these to our vendors once a year and to every one of our vendors. And obviously that doesn't scale. And obviously it's very difficult to build a trust relationship when you have that, sort of almost, I don't want to say adversarial position, but you have this position in which someone's trying to prove that we can really trust this company. So one of the approaches I took there, seeing the huge amount of manual pain we had, was, and by manual, I mean, we were just mailing spreadsheets back and forth all day long. Here's our spreadsheet of questions. We're going to mail it to the vendor. The vendor's going to fill out, 2/3 of the questions. We're going to say, oh, this isn't good enough. We're going to mail it back. And months, sometimes weeks later, we would realize, are we a slave to the process, or are we actually trying to evaluate whether or not we trust doing business with this vendor? So my not so brilliant idea was, why don't we just try transparency? Why don't we just try to say, look, we're going to build a good internal process to assess our vendors. And then rather than sending your internal auditors to us for a few days once a year, we're just going to be radically transparent about, here's how we assess our vendors. We're going to share that with you, our customers, and you can make your own determination about whether we're doing a good job or not. And I think the reason I go into that story is, I think that's, after sort of dancing around a few different alternatives, I think that's where the industry is finally trending towards. And when I say the industry, it's not just the industry itself. Because of some really scary cyber attacks that were partially successful against critical infrastructure in the United States over the past several years, probably the one that people remember most recently is the Colonial Pipeline hack a few years ago. Anytime you have attackers, possibly nation-state attackers, targeting critical infrastructure around power, healthcare, other utilities like that, the government tends to wake up. And that's what happened a few years ago. The Biden office issued an executive order that said you must protect critical infrastructure. And to do so, you must protect your supply chain. Now, we've already had some regulations around critical infrastructure physically in the US, but this was the first time there was an executive order that really focused on the software supply chain. So I think that's one of the major things that changed here. Let me pause for a second and see if Fernando has anything you want to share about your experiences. I know you've been involved with trust for a long time as well. Anything you want to share about your experiences of how trust has evolved? And then I'll come back and I'll talk about some of the recent hacks that scare me at least.
Thank you, Teddy. Before I start, I want to express that the opinions that I make in this webinar are my own and not my organization. But definitely, there's a lot of stories that I can recall that made the security of or organizations be put into a state that's more challenging, um, it's because of the fact that we need to get some comfort on the vendors that we're actually leveraging. So in the past, right? Traditionally, we do a SOC 2 report, right? So if you're a vendor, you wanted to get some comfort on the security, availability, and confidentiality of your vendor. So that's why you request a SOC 2 Type 2 report. And as we all know, the SOC 2 Type 2 report has gone through a long way, right? It's a 6 month, typically you do a 6 month period of attestation for an audit. And then basically, if you have a SOC 2 report, you get some comfort. If I'm trying to buy a platform, if I'm trying to buy a software, right? And then I take a look at the SOC 2 report, I look at the report, it's a clean report, I get some comfort on it, right? And that's why I leverage that. And we've come to a long way on using that platform. But again, I think as you had mentioned, Terry, the threat has been evolving, it's changing, right? And that's no longer sufficient, right? A SOC 2 report is a period of time, right? So a 6 month period, but after that, what happens to the controls in the organization? That's why I felt like the SBOM and this new trend on the SEC are very important on how we're actually evolving from a security landscape.
That's great. By the way, it's a super small world in cybersecurity, and Fernando and I have actually worked together a few times. So one of the points of pain I'll call out is you wouldn't expect it, but I feel like we've reached this point of confluence in the need for the software supply chain through various angles. And it's fascinating to me how all the different frameworks and certifications and attestations have tried to take a stab at it. Fernando mentioned SOC 2, but even Sarbanes-Oxley, which is really a financial anti-fraud regulation in the United States, even it has a component where you have to review the SOC 1 reports, that is the business credibility, I'll call it, of your critical vendors. Now, I don't know about you, but asking perhaps financial internal auditors to review the SOC 1 business report on how good a vendor does at acting as an organization, that's great. But that does not give me, as a cybersecurity professional, a ton of confidence about how they're working in the software supply chain. And it certainly doesn't encompass what I think some of the real attack vectors are, which is open source software. Anything you want to add, Ruby, or should I dive into open source?
No, I think that we are going in the right direction because I think that what's going on is that software supply chain attacks were always there. I remember some before they were called this way, but I think that the explosion of open source and the situation where organization became much better in protecting themselves, and the most cost-effective way to penetrate was through their supply chains, made this become a huge problem in the last several years. Mm-hmm. And regulation-wise, I think that what we see is a response from the governments. And you know that governments always respond late and slow. And now, because it is so aggressive and so fast, it means that they recognize that this is a huge challenge for them and they need to go out of their skin to do something a bit differently. That's all I have to add.
Yeah, well, maybe let's touch on the frameworks before I roll up my sleeves and dive into the open source horror stories. There's two, in addition to the Biden executive order that's been out, I guess 2 years now. And it's, it has been a little theoretical, but the rubber's going to really start hitting the road for vendors who are supplying services to the government over the course of the next year, and then it will start to cascade down through the rest of the industry. Right? If you're in the supply chain, if you're a vendor, if you're in the supply chain of someone who has to do business with government and has to meet the standards of software supply chain security, trust me, they're going to pass that on to you. We saw that with various other regulations, right? So there are two. I love how you called out the government's approach here, Ruby, with a little shade. But the government's approach has been the executive order, which is maybe heavy-handed, but also it gives us a backstop, right? We can't just. This is not a nice to have. This is something people are going to have to take seriously, which I love. Again, after 10 years of sort of fumbling around and trying to come up with a solution, I think it's great that we have a way to go to our business leaders and say, this is real. Our customers are going to ask for this. We better be prepared. So how do you produce an SBOM, a software bill of materials? There's really two. I don't think they're competing. I think they're complementary frameworks. One is SSDF, which is if anyone has ever worked on any of the NIST frameworks, the NIST 800 series, like 853, et cetera. SSDF is really just a NIST document, and the NIST documents in the US are kind of the high bar by which you understand whether or not your cybersecurity practices are good and solid and should be trusted by your customers. So SSDF is NIST 800-218, and you can read the document online. It really just says, look, there are 4 components to securing your software supply chain. First of all, you have to prepare your organization. You have to have governance, right? That's the G in GRC. You actually have to have governance toned from the top all the way down, that we're going to take this seriously. We're going to fund it. We're going to organize teams in the right way, et cetera, to make this happen. And then you have to protect your software. You have to find a way to actually protect the software itself, the source code, things like that. And then you have to protect your ability to produce secure software. And that is your build systems, your code repos, of course, but your build systems, your release, your deploy systems, all that pipeline has to be secure. So you can have good code, but what happens between code and releasing the software into production, if you're a SaaS company, who knows? That's the third step, right, of SSDF, is you really have to understand that pipeline and you have to secure it. And I love this fourth part, you have to respond to vulnerabilities. It's amazing to me that so many conversations I have with customers of companies I've been at, when we get into the service agreement phase and we're looking at like the red lines, there's so much conversation around, are you going to patch vulnerabilities? I mean, I hope so, right? I hope every vendor I use is patching vulnerabilities, but there's a lot of conversation and a lot of red lines around how quickly can you commit to patching vulnerabilities? And there's a reason for that. It's hard, right? Where are those vulnerabilities? How do I find them across our enterprise software, our build and deploy packages, our source code, and the dirty secret of the internet these days, all the open source software we're using. So that's one thing I love about SSDF. And then SALSA is NIST is a government-ish framework in the US. SALSA is I guess I call it an open standard that is sort of collaborated on by Google and OpenSSF and some other groups that came together and said, hey, we should have our own, like we should keep ourselves honest in the way that the industry created PCI. How do we trust ourselves in our industry? So SALSA has a different approach, and we can dive into that later. But I'm curious, do either of you have any thoughts about the SSDF and the process I went through? Fernando, I know you're a veteran of helping companies understand frameworks and turning compliance frameworks into action for technology teams. What are your thoughts about the usability of SSDF?
Thanks, Eddie. As a former auditor, right, we've seen many of these implementations of SSDF in many companies here in Silicon Valley, and I think you really hit the nail in the head that one of the first things that we have to do is to make sure that you have organizational support, you have leadership support, right? Because this is not implementing a secure software development lifecycle and framework is not an easy task, right? We had evolved significantly from doing like a waterfall approach, and then now we're agile. Like everybody had we wanted to move things quickly, right? but we have to, and it's more of like a balancing act between like how fast can the business deliver the software and then meet the demands of our customers, and also ensuring that we have appropriate guardrails in place. And I think SSDF provides us with that, right? For example, like, if you have your access to your repo, you have to ensure you have appropriate access controls. Only the right host can actually push it into production. If you're using Jenkins, you do the same thing, right? So what I've seen right now in the industry is that there is a trend of like ensuring that what we actually push out to our consumers have appropriate security measures in place, right? And again, in my opinion, it's a tone from the top. The leadership will have to provide their support. Security is an important component because in the long run, right, it will, in my opinion, if you create and build software that is in accord with appropriate security measures, it will pay dividends, right? From a customer and trust perspective, from the government perspective. Now that the government is looking into this, this is more reason why people should pay attention in this. In the past, people can just like, I'm gonna go ahead and hire a set of auditors. I was a former auditor, so totally understand that. You have a set of auditors, you hire them, they do an assessment of your software security development lifecycle, maybe through a SOC 2 audit, and you pass. That's great, right? However, like the continuous improvement, the continuous security of your software is a very important component. And I think it's like a crawl, walk, run, right? At this stage, continuously to evolve and improve our security measures. That's just how I see it.
Yes. I would like to add. I first of all, I agree with both of you. I think that we are in the middle, really in the middle of a big evolution, both in regulation and in the adoption. If this is the evolution, and 10 years ago we've been apes, we are not Homo sapiens yet. We are maybe Homo erectus or Neanderthal. Like we are somewhere in between. We are walking on two legs, but like we have a way to go. Okay, and this is also where I think the SSDF is today, and I think that the NIST is going. First of all, I think it's excellent, and it's building on a lot of frameworks and concepts of the last 3 or 4 years. There is a convergence of ideas. The In-Toto framework and SALSA and the attestation concept and the evidence-based compliance. Like we have a lot of new frameworks pouring into a very vibrant discussion, and I think that the SALSA that we have today and the SSDF that we have today are really just starting to form. For example, the Biden administration posted a memorandum in September 2023 that for the first time they're depicting what's going to be the implications if you don't comply, and if you don't comply by the end of 2024, then agencies need to cancel contracts with their vendors. But we have already seen, starting in this January, the CISA self-attestation form goes into action. And actually, I know personally the first company that already had to sign the self-attestation form. So this is a real thing now. And the self-attestation form today basically says that you are doing more or less what is written in the NIST 800 to 18 in the SSDF. More or less. Okay, it's not like a word for word. And you declare, this is what self-attestation means. You you are attesting yourself that this is not evidence-based. But
Right.
if something happens, then unless you have the evidence, you have gathered the S-bombs, you have gathered the history trail of how you handled vulnerabilities, if you don't do that, then you're not in a good place. And maybe a few other frameworks that I would like to just to mention, basically names here, is I think that the NSA put out a great documentation about what should be their recommendations for a software bill of materials management platform are. This is the most comprehensive framework of SBOM management that I've seen to date. It's really, really good. And I saw that the FDA was the first regulator to adopt the SSDF. Actually, they call it the SPDF, the Secure Product framework. And it also talks about S-bombs and vulnerabilities, control, transparency, all the stuff that you have mentioned. And also across the ocean, just to name the most important ones, then we see the CRA in Europe by the EU, the Cyber Resilience Act, which actually takes, like in the SSDF, put the burden on software security on the shoulders of the software producer in terms of making sure that they provide patching for vulnerabilities throughout the entire life cycle of the product, providing transparency, etc. And I've also seen lately very high penalties for non-compliance for this and for the NIS2, the new NIS2, which is a more comprehensive EU cyber regulation that can go up to 2.5% of the global turnover. This is like the GDPR, if you remember. And maybe also just to name a few other regulations that go in line with this, the same concept than we see in Japan, mainly S-bombs recommendation. They want to make sure that Japanese companies would be able to continue and sell to the US. And even in countries like Australia, actually Australia has some of the most advanced cyber regulation that I've seen. It's about SDLC security, but also a lot about S-bombs. And in Germany, I mean, Germany is part of the EU, but it was important enough for them to put their own regulation talking about S-bombs, and they are actually mimicking the US. And in the end of their document, they say, you want more information, go to the NTIA document and to the CISA documents, and there is ample of information there. So this is like a first coverage of the what we see around the world. That what we see is that all over the governments, actually the regulators, started to they recognize that there is a market failure, and they want to expedite the evolution from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens and make sure that there are the frameworks and the tools outside.
That's a great call out. You wouldn't think of it, I suppose, but Germany and Australia have always been leaders in coming up with their own frameworks. I think eight years ago or so, I first had to deal with TÜV in Germany, and as a compliance framework, and IRAP in Australia. And I think it's good and bad. It's a bit like the weird state of privacy in the United States today, where there's no national or federal regulation for privacy. So every state seems to be developing their own, and in a lot of cases they're sort of picking a standard like CPRA in the US and in California, but they're adding their own tweaks to it, and it's going to be a mess, right? I don't work in privacy as much anymore as I have in the past, but it is a little wild to try to understand. Like, I can't just pull a NIST guide off the shelf, and if I follow this, I'm sure I'm going to meet all those requirements. So I think that is a danger. Is right. There's a patchwork of these different regulations, and it keeps trust and compliance teams well employed, I suppose. But is it really increasing our trust in terms of the software build and release process? I don't know. I'm a data-driven, evidence-based person, and I find that things like having to produce an SBOM are really what's going to move the needle in a business-to-business context. And I know Fernando's had quite a bit of experience. I'm a head of security, so all of this is a piece of my job, but not the whole job. And I love talking to people like Ruby, because I'm just frantically making notes here of all the different things that he knows about. And I'm like, I have to research that. But Fernando has been on the front lines as the head of trust with a lot of those direct customer communications. And I'm curious, Fernando, do you have anything to share about like how those conversations happen? Maybe to pull from the title here, the good, the bad, and the beautiful. Yeah. Like, what works today in terms of that trust relationship you're trying to build B2B? And then maybe we can talk about the evolution, as Ruby calls it, of like where we need to go.
Yeah. So in prior experiences, Terry, like having, in my opinion, having a good relationship with your customers is very critical, as we all know, right? And the root of that one is the customers really trusting you. And how do you actually develop that trust? That trust is built by transparency. You have to tell the customers what you can do or what you can't do. And that includes, from an organization, especially a high-moving organization like most of the companies here in Silicon Valley, right? It's a coordination between multiple departments within the org. Your compliance organization, your legal organization, your engineering function, especially your engineering functions, because you can't promise something you can't deliver. And that's one way to break the trust in the relationship with your customers and stakeholders. So what I've been seeing right now in the industry is like there's a lot of like being transparent in terms of like having things like a trust center would be helpful, right? Yeah. If for example, if we are evaluating partners or vendors, the first thing that you want to look at is you Google it. You're gonna Google the vendor, right? You're gonna take a look at like, is there anything within this vendor that's a red flag? Do they even have a trust center? So if they have a trust center, do they have a SOC 2 Type 2 report? Or do they have an ISO 27001 report? Those are the first things that you look at. Then you download that, and then you review it, and then you identify red flags, and then that gives you a certain sense of comfort, right? That they're actually doing the right thing, appropriate guardrails in place. Of course, again, a SOC 2 or ISO 27001 report is not an absolute. This is a convo that I always have with people, right? Those reports provides reasonable assurance. This is my auditor speak here, right? They provide reasonable assurance that appropriate measures were in place for a certain period of time, but they're not absolute. It means that it's not free from potential, from other potential risks such as collusion. It's not free from that. So if other people decide to like this, let's do something at the back of the auditors, you will miss that. So it's a reasonable assurance approach. So what I'm trying to convey here is that trust is a very important component of every relationship, especially from a business-to-business perspective.
So, Fernando, I would like to ask you one more question. Okay, so with software supply chain, the old school, quote unquote, old school SOC 2 and the ISO 27001. I mean, they build some like a minimum level of trust with the vendor, but they don't protect from software supply chain attacks at all, actually, almost at all. Okay, I bet that most or all of the organizations, or at least the commercial companies that have been attacked, they had SOC 2. Okay.
That's yes,
Yeah,
that's a fair statement. I think
yeah,
that's a fair statement, Louis.
and I think that the way that the new frameworks, the new best practices, standards, regulation is taking us is to a new era of continuous assurance, not like a once a year assurance by a third party auditor, but an evidence-based continuous assurance. What are your thoughts about it? Like what is going on with the trust and the means to achieve trust?
Yep. That's an excellent question, Ruby. But before I deep dive in the traditional compliance approach, I just want to state that we've come a long way in the compliance space, right? We've come a long way. We have now, if you are evaluating a software that you're planning to use in your organization, you have a SOC 2 type to report, and people are now more educated, right? A SOC 2 type to report is just business enabler. You cannot engage in a business development effort without your SOC 2 Type 2 report on ISO 27001. Those are business enablers. It allows you to have a seat in the table. So I want to make sure that I'm not devaluing the benefits of a SOC 2 Type 2 report. It's very important, and I think that's one of the first things that gets your customer build that certain level of trust. It's still very important. However, as we had mentioned and discussed in this convo, right, that there is an evolving way to make things better. As you asked, like all those organizations that had potential breach, do they have SOC 2 Type to report? Yes, they do, right? But again, as I mentioned earlier, reasonable assurance, not absolute, right? So now, going back to like the new SSSC compliance, how do we actually make this thing better? I think SBOM, in my opinion, provides a unique opportunity to make things, the relationship between the customers and the software suppliers better, because it creates a level of trust. Imagine this. If I am a consumer of an application or a software, and I can go to my manufacturer and say, I want to see every component of this thing that I'm going to be consuming and integrating to my platform. I want to see it. And then also tell me the vulnerabilities that you have and when are you going to fix it? How will that make you feel? I'll feel amazing if I have that, right? And again, this is an emerging trend, and I think a unique opportunity for both parties, consumer of the application, supplier of the application, to actually build, right? I think it's a very good thing. Are we there? We're moving towards that direction, but in my opinion, it's moving, but we're not there yet fully, right? The ability to generate an SBOM and is not prevalent across many folks that I talk to, right? They're not implementing that, but given the Biden administration initiative, executive order, and then also the changing landscape outside the United States. You mentioned earlier about Japan, right? I used to work for a company in Japan as a client, right? And then when I work with these guys, they're very detailed on their audits as well. And then they are looking at the United States as the beacon. They're looking at the US and say, what is the United States doing? Mm-hmm. And they are basically passing that to their regulations. So I think there is a path to get there, right? I think we're moving towards the right direction, and I think there's just a big opportunity for both consumer and manufacturer of the software to make things better from a security perspective, building trust. That's my take on this.
Yeah, since it's a great answer, Fernando. I think since you mentioned trust and you mentioned trust centers, I do want to make a call out. I am not a complete curmudgeon, and I do want to call out that in the past 5 years or so, we have had some tools come out that are really good in terms of building a more formal process of having that business to business trust relationship, which is basically a trust center. It is a huge leap forward, right? It is very targeted and it solves a very real business problem we have. And I mean, I use the 80-20 rule here. I still get 20% of our customers who mail my security team and say, hey, can you send us your SOC 2 report? Well, if you just go to our trust center, you can get past the NDA and download wherever you want. So that is progress, and I do want to call that out. And I applaud the vendors who saw that very real, tangible problem in the market and filled that gap, and that has saved us a ton of hours that we need to be working on real security problems. But we still, even if you have a trust center, you're still going to get questions every time there's a vulnerability in an open source package, because again, that's the dirty secret of the internet, is that everything's built on open source. So a couple years ago, when we had the Log4j, right, which led to the Log4Shell vulnerability, that was comprehensive. I don't think everyone realized how deeply Log4j was used. And when we had this sudden realization of the Log4Shell vulnerability, I sure got a whole bunch of emails from all our customers saying, are you impacted by the Log4Shell vulnerability? How much? Can you give us assurance that you've patched, blah, blah, blah. It's a very manual process, in addition to the internal process of actually finding where we as a company were using it, because it's not fun to admit to, but when I say Sarbanes-Oxley requires you to get a list of critical vendors and review their SOC 1 reports, that's great. But I'm not worried about, AWS having, which is a critical vendor. I'm not so worried about them. What I am worried about is all these open source packages that we're relying on. And the amount, for those who don't work deeply in the weeds of how software is built, we rely on so many open source dependencies. It is mind blowing. And Log4j was a few years ago, so maybe that's old and tired. But probably everyone on this call has heard about the more recent XJUtils vulnerability, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And forgive me for nerding out, but I find this fascinating. So for those who don't know, XJUtils is just it's a zip utility, right? It's a data compressor like gzip, or if you're on Windows, the zip utilities, things like that. It makes big files smaller, and that's really important to core functioning of Linux systems, because you have a lot of large files that you want to compress to small and then ship them, and then once you have them on target systems, you expand them. So it's not officially a part of a lot of core. It's not a part of OpenSSH or things like that are core parts of the Linux operating system, but it is so prevalent because it fills a need. And a lot of people have just started using it. And once you start using these open source packages, it's tough to get away from them, because you depend on them. That's what dependency means. And you just ship it with every version of the software. But it's an open source package. It's not a consumer package. There's no company that built XJUtils. There's some poor guy out there who saw a need and said, I'm going to write something that fills this need. And then other developers saw that and said, oh, this is great, I'm going to use it, which is a dependency. And then the person who built it is not getting paid. As more and more pieces of software use it, and again, that's the dirty secret of the internet, is that it's built on open source software. If hundreds of thousands of companies are using that package, that person's not making hundreds of thousands more dollars, if any dollars. So maintaining open source packages is a thankless task. So how did XJUtils get this vulnerability? Well, it's a little scary. Honestly, as I learned about it, as I started uncovering the weeds, I thought, oh my gosh, this is a real problem in industry. And I do think we're moving in the right direction with SBOMs, which could, expose these kind of vulnerabilities. But basically, investigation's still underway, but it seems like probably a nation state attacker over the course of, I think, 2 years, just reached out to the maintainer of XJUtils, and then that's another secret, is like one maintainer may have 100 different open source packages they maintain, right? So they're splitting their attention unpaid across all these things. And over time, you focus on the more interesting recent one, and some of the older stuff, you get to it when you can. So there's this attack pattern where sometimes attackers will just, well, not necessarily attackers, I should say, people who want to get credit for contributing to a package, which is, it's some dev street cred to be able to say, oh yes, I help, I'm a contributor to the XEUtils package. And sometimes what they do is they just submit these silly little like documentation wording changes and say, hey, can you merge this? Or, I added this little tweak to make something faster or whatever, right? But over the course of like 2 years, this one individual, or it may have been a team of individuals, we don't know, started submitting requests to the maintainer of XEUtils saying, hey, can you fix this? Can you patch this? Can you add my code, etc.? And kind of wore the guy down over time. And he was like, you know what? I don't have the time or the energy to maintain this. And there were some other people, maybe that same individual under different usernames, started chiming in saying like, yeah, this package is important. Why isn't the maintainer doing this job? And just created a whole bunch of pressure. And finally the maintainer said, you know what, I really don't have the passion or the time to maintain this anymore. I'm just going to transfer it over to this new guy. The username was Giatan. I'm going to give Giatan the ownership of this repo, and I'm going to bow out. I'm not going to be involved anymore. And that's what they were looking for, because they just started to insert malicious code into the XEUtils package. That's terrifying. But what's even more terrifying is that it was a complete accident that we discovered this. There was no software scanner or like big compliance framework that caught this. Some other developer out there was just running some performance tests, and he noticed that the XEUtils utility was running like microseconds slower than it used to in the past. And so he posted on some forums like, this is weird. Like, why is this happening? And people started pulling on the thread, and they realized there's malicious code in here in this like core piece that's used on software by probably every modern software company out there. And that's how we found XEUtils, a complete accident. That's what terrifies me about these more compliance-based approaches and not taking a data-driven approach to your code, your dependencies, your build and release process, and having that direct evidence-based validation.
Yeah, well, I think, Terry, that the new compliance, the new regulations, I mean, they recognize it. I have been talking 3 years ago. I remember a talk just after Log4j erupted with a US official. And, the Log4j, it was a bug. It was not something, it was not a malicious code that a rogue developer put inside, right? But I think that even before Log4j and more so after, it gave a lot of food for thought for attackers. Okay, Log4j was an incident, but we can make this happen on purpose, okay, in places that are more relevant for us. And maybe XEUtils is an outcome of that. And from an attacker perspective, especially a nation state perspective, this is one of the most cost-effective attack vectors ever. You don't need to do almost, you need to develop a piece of code that does not look malicious,
sure,
that looks innocent, and to social engineer your way inside, right? But you don't need like masses of attackers working for 2 years with $1 million budget, right? It's like a team of 5 people can do that. And this is why software supply chain are so attractive for attackers. They are just so goddamn easy, right? It's not easy to make such a piece of art of malicious code that look innocent, but it is way, way easier than the alternatives, right?
Yeah. And sometimes they use interesting techniques, right? Like they may have a malicious code injection or be creating an outbound network connection, and they obfuscate it by, instead of saying like, we're sending your code to evilhacker.com, They do something like they turn the first part of the word evil into hex code, so you can't read it with human eyes, right? You have to have a machine to read it. And then they use a join, right? They don't put the .com, which is a string you might recognize, but they join the com and this hex code, and together that creates the vulnerability. That's I mean, even if you throw bodies at the problem, there's no human way to catch these at scale, given the huge number of vulnerabilities and the potential vulnerabilities and the huge number of dependencies in open source software. You have to have a tool. You have to invest in tooling that will help you. I like the NIST, the SSDF approach, which is a very governance-based one, but I have to invest in tools to make this reasonably, to use Fernando's phrase, you have to have reasonable assurance at scale that you're catching these things. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be on this webinar. Is I'm glad that we are starting to see some tools that are really focusing on giving people like me the ability to handle this at scale. I can't just hire a team of 100 auditors to look through every line of code. And even if I did, would they really catch these things? It's impossible.
Okay, so gentlemen, we need to wrap it up, and to do so, I want to allow each one of you to provide their 100 seconds overview of. We talked about risk, we talked about trust, we talked about compliance. What is the connection? How do you see it? Does compliance reduce risk in the end of the day? Does it increase trust? How do you see it?
Fernando, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I can start with that. So the way that I see it, I always have an analogy of a house, right? So if you're inviting someone to your house, you had to make sure that you have certain guardrails in place to make sure that your house is safe. That's your compliance function. Provides the fundamentals, the foundations and security that your house is safe. If you're inviting somebody like a customer, a stakeholder coming into your house, they're trusting you that they're not gonna die if they go inside your house, right? That's or they're not gonna be put in a very dangerous position. So that's how I evaluate compliance and trust. So trust is earned. Compliance provides your stakeholders the ability to trust you, right? And compliance reduces the amount of risk. The same analogy, if there is like a strong typhoon outside, that's your risk. Your risk gets reduced because you have a strong foundation from a compliance perspective. And again, one of the other things that I always wanted to add, because I always advocate for compliance and providing guidance to our stakeholders and protecting them. Trust is earned. Trust is earned, and you have to do everything that you can to keep that trust. Because once trust is broken, that makes your life as a business and even as individuals very, very difficult. But if you ensure that you have a good trust relationship with your stakeholders, I think that's a secret recipe to be successful.
That's great. I love that Fernando's using the analogy of the Saw movies to talk about.
Yeah, I watch too much horror movies. Sorry. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, I might steal that one. I think I've talked enough in this webinar, but I'll encapsulate this by saying I feel that I've done the same job over time, but for most of my career, I have been an engineer, not a cybersecurity professional. I see it as an evolution, but engineers have a tough job, right? They are trying to produce the software that enables that business to succeed, either succeed at traditional enterprises and supporting that business, or succeed at actually selling software, right? Whether you're an on-premise or a SaaS vendor. And as cybersecurity professionals, we have to give them the tools to succeed. It's not enough to just say, here's a bunch of vulns, go fix them and do it fast. The vertical teams that are working on building software are focused on building software and meeting the needs of the business. And we have to lean over the line, and we have to be empathetic to understanding the plight that it's hard to meet those like ship deadlines. And it's hard to work under the relentless pressure from product and the business to ship fast. So what do? You have to invest in the frameworks as a playbook to understand where we are and where we need to be. And if you're struggling on where to start, I'd probably pick. It's good for us to understand SSDF, but a good playbook is Salsa, because Salsa has 4 levels. You don't have to jump to level 4 right away. You can just start with level 1, which says, hey, you should probably have some sort of documentation about how you built this software that you shipped. That's a place to start, right? And I think if you do that, and you'll very quickly realize the need for tools, because you'll see all of those dependencies, especially open source dependencies. And you'll probably wind up realizing we have to approach this as a business problem, and we have to invest in tooling to make it sustainable at scale. If we're releasing 5 times a day in the Agile world, I'm not going to manually write documentation for an SBOM 5 times a day. To scale up to that, you need to invest in tooling.
Thank you. I loved both your answers, and I want to thank you for your insights and sharing your thoughts about this. In the last 3 years, this really became my passion. And basically, I think that you need to reduce your risk, and you need the tools and the frameworks for this. And if you do it for a long time, you will earn trust. And then software supply chain compliance will be a byproduct. There is a lot more materials. I'm saying this to our audience in a Scribe website. If you want to know more, we have written so much about SSDF and Salsa, and we just released an infographic about regulation around the world. And just go to our resources section, and you'll find really everything you need to know and more about it. And Scribe is there to help anybody who needs to reduce risk, earn trust, or comply, to do it in the most frictionless way that we know. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Terry. And hope to see you in RSA in a week and a half.
Thank you for having us, Ruby.
Bye.